Después, ¿qué? Okay. Boa tarde, sejam bem-vindos. Eu vou só fazer uma pequena introdução em português, que eu faço logo em inglês. Portanto, vai ser sabem, eles escreveram e fizeram algumas questões. O objetivo desta reunião vai ser, por um lado, enfim, dar uma visão geral sobre algumas destas questões que estão aqui a ser discutidas, sem ir aos detalhes do relatório, mas também, portanto, dar a oportunidade de vários setores, desde estudantes, professores, cientistas, pessoas da administração pública, do poder autárquico, de colocar e de esclarecer alguns pontos. Portanto, estas questões foram postas quando se inscreveram, muitas delas, e são essas que iremos começar por tratar. Portanto, vamos ter, basicamente, três partes. Uma parte em que o painel vai intervir, uma segunda parte em que vamos tratar de questões mais ligadas a questões de vulnerabilidade, adaptação, e depois, portanto, que são, digamos, de interesse mais dos administradores públicos, e depois questões que têm a ver com quais são as lacunas que existem no ponto de vista científico que têm que ser estudadas. I was just explaining in Portuguese what was the objective of this meeting. So initially we will start with some statements by the members of the panel, and then we'll address the questions that were, or comments that were put in when you registered. And these include, in the first place, aspects to do with impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation. And then the last part will be about gaps in science, because here we have a heterogeneous group, and one of the groups are the scientists from the university, at least, perhaps from some other places. So I'll start by introducing the panel. Here on my left, it's Yuba Sokona. Then it's Thelma Krug. You already met her yesterday on the television. Deborah Roberts, Bronwyn Hayward, and Hans Portner. So we'll start, and we'll start with a small presentation by Yuba, which will explain how the IPCC works.
Okay, good evening. Good evening, and I'm sorry that I cannot speak Portuguese because I have a good friend from Brazil, but she never managed to train me how to speak Portuguese. Maybe next time I will come back to Faro and then I will learn Portuguese. I'll try just to give you a brief on IPCC and insisting on this cycle, the sixth assessment cycle of IPCC. Just by curiosity, I just want to know who have read the summary for the policymaker of the IPCC last special report on ocean and cryosphere. The land report, climate and land. The 1.5 report. Good. So there is some people who read IPCC report. I think that's useful. IPCC started in 1988, and it had been established by WMO and UNEP. And since then, almost every 6 years, it produced one assessment report, and within the cycle, there is a number of special reports that IPCC produce. And each of the report of Ipcc have lead to some key decision at political level, because it's a panel, it's a government panel made by 196 or 95 government. And then the first report has been instrumental to the convention of UNFCCC. And then the second assessment report was important as the first one on the UNFCCC, the second on the Kyoto Protocol, and then throughout adaptation came, and then the last report of Ipcc has been instrumental in the Paris Agreement, and this cycle will inform the global stocktake. Next. And it's important to understand the role of Ipcc. That is very important. You see, that will drive us, and then we reiterate it, because many people said that Ipcc modeled, Ipcc, we are not doing any research, and then what we are doing, Ipcc assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impact, and option for adaptation and mitigation. We are assessing the literature that is published. That is not coming from us. It is scientists who publish the literature. It could be peer-reviewed literature, it could be non-peer-reviewed literature, but we rely largely on peer-reviewed literature. Next. An Ipcc report should be neutral with respect to policy, although they may need to deal objectively with scientific, technical, socioeconomic factors relevant to application of particular policies. We said that we are policy relevant, we are not policy prescriptive. We never make any recommendation, and we never advise anyone. We just produce what we find in the literature. Next, please. And there is 10 steps of the production of Ipcc report. I will just highlight a few of them that are very important for you. After the scoping, but the scoping is done by the expert and the government. They do together, they conceive in the scoping, and then there will be an outline of the report, the different reports, and then that is approved by the government. And then after the approval of the outline of the report, after the scoping, we have nomination of the authors, the selection of the author. I will not go to any detail. It's very important to notice that the first order draft of any report is reviewed by the expert, which is the internal expert. And then the second order draft is sent to the government and expert, and anyone, any citizen in this planet can participate in the Ipcc process. You just need to register on the website for Ipcc. You will have a credential, and then you can get the report. If you want to comment on to review one paragraph, you will do it. If you want a chapter, you will do it. If you want to review the whole report, you will do it. You can do it. And in the author, we do have a co-chairs. In this report, the co-chair of the working group 2 are Hans and Deborah, and then they have the coordinating lead author with each of the chapters. And then they have authors that work with coordinating author. We do have contributing authors, and they will not participate in the meeting, such as the meeting we are here, and then they will fill some of the element where the author do not have the expertise and some different elements. And then we have a review editor, and then they make sure that all the comments that received by the authors are responded. All the comments we receive. And then from that, we will have the final draft with the summary for the policymakers. And then the summary for the policymaker is approved line by line by the government and the scientists and those who wrote the report. And this is what the general public understand. But the summary for the policymaker, any element there is supported by the underlying report, by the 1,000 pages. And then from that, we go to the publication of the report. Next, please. And in this cycle, we have 3 special reports. And then this 1.5 degrees Celsius that was released last October in 2018. And last year we had a climate and land report in August, and then ocean and crust report in September. And then all those, the 1.5 informed the Talanoa dialogue of the UNFCCC. We also had a methodology report that was released in May 2019, the refinement of Ipcc guideline for national greenhouse gas inventories. And then we have been asked to do some other special report because we could not do more than 3, but we had we paid special attention on the cities and urban issues, and then we had a scientific conference in Edmonton on cities and climate change. And then we have, after those different reports, we have the main report that has the contribution of the 3 working groups. Working group 1 on the physical science, working group 2 that is meeting here on impact, adaptation, vulnerability, working group 3 on the mitigation. And then all the 3 working groups will be released in 2021, and then the synthesis report that will be on 2022 of the, so that will inform the global stocktake on 2023. Next, please. And those are the 3 different reports you can download, and then you can download the summary for a policymaker, and then if you have enough time and interest, and then you can download all the reports and then to go through them. Next, please. And I will pass that. Let us go to the key message. You know, all the 1,000 pages for 1.5 can be synthesized in 3 lines. Every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Next, please. On the land also, land is a critical resource. Let us go, let us move on. And then just to, again. And then here again, the 3 key bullet points that can capture the finding of the land report. Land is undergoing human pressure, and then the climate will add on that pressure. Land is a part of the solution, but land cannot do it all. It can do certain part, but not all. Next, please. Ocean and cryosphere also, the world glacier, polar region, and ocean are being transformed by human-caused climate change. Next, let us go on. And then our ocean and cryosphere share again to capture the key findings. Our ocean and cryosphere, they sustain us. They are under pressure. Their changes affect all our lives, and then the time for action is now. Next, please. And this is just the refinement of the methodology, of inventory methodology. I will not go to any detail. This is the overview of the different chapters. This is classical. There is nothing new apart the fact that there is some more element that has been incorporated. Next, please. And then on the working group, this is the the outline of working group 1 of 12 chapters, and there is some new element comparing to the previous one. Next, please. On the working group 2, the outline, please. And then here again, I will not go to any detail, just to give an indication of the various section. And this, next, please. Next, please. On the 18 different chapters, including the regional chapter that are very important. Next, please. And the working group of 3, next, please. Here again, there is the 17 different chapters, and there is some new element if you compare it to the previous report. I will not go also in any detail. Next, please. And those are the 6 assessment cycle, as I indicated, starting with the report of 1.5 on the emission inventories refinement, ocean and cryosphere, and then the land, And in April 2021, we will have the physical, the contribution of working group 1 approval. In October 2021, and that will be in July 2021, that will be the mitigation of working group 3. In October, on climate change impact adaptation and vulnerability working group 2, and then the synthesis of the whole cycle, including the special report, will be in April 2022. Next, please. And as I indicated, we had different other reports, such as the Cities and Climate Science Conference in March 2018 in Canada. In May 2018, we had an expert meeting on assessing climate information for region in Italy. And in May 2018, we had an expert meeting on short-lived climate forces in Geneva. Next, please. And then there are some overarching preliminary aspects for the synthesis report, such as the global stocktake, that is very important, the interaction among emission, climate risk and development, and then finance mean for support. And then that gives to you an indication of the different timeline of the different contribution of the 6 assessment cycle. Next, please. And then, as I indicated, the October 1.5 informed the Talanoa dialogue, and then the whole assessment of this cycle will inform the global stocktake of 2023. Next, please. And those are some information, and then the website of Ipcc, the contact of the Secretariat, and those who are also on the social media, some connection. Those are very briefly some just key elements to set the scene I want to bring to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. So after this small introduction so that we have an idea of how the Ipcc works, Thelma will tell us the multidisciplinary approach that it has to, that as you can imagine, has to exist to tackle so many different issues around climate change. So Thelma.
Adelino, obrigada. Boa noite a todos. Assim, eu estava pensando em fazer a minha apresentação em português.
Mas há aqui pessoas de
fora. Há pessoas de fora.
É melhor falar
então,
inglês.
Não tem problema. Eu gostaria muito de falar no meu português, mas vou fazer essa minha intervenção em inglês. Sometimes people think that, when you're addressing climate change, we need really to go in depth, engaging the physical scientists. But the nature of the work that Ipcc does really engages all types of sciences. It's really multidisciplinary, as you have seen from all the outlines of the working groups 1, 2, and 3 that Yuba showed. So you're talking about a range of issues that not only engage the physical scientists, but we need to have also the natural scientists. We need to have the social scientists. So it became really important when, for instance, the first product that Ipcc did in this cycle was this special report on 1.5, global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unlike the other special reports, this one was an invitation from the Climate Change Convention. They wanted, the Ipcc to explore the risks of impacts of a global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and also wanted to have an indication of what would be the potential trajectories, ways, in terms of emissions that could lead to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius at the end of this century relative to pre-industrial times. Obviously, when we get an invitation from the Climate Change Convention, which is the political forum, let's say, and Ipcc is the scientific forum, or arena, I would say, this invitation is brought to the attention of the 195 member governments of the Ipcc. Basically, they are the same in that are, dealing politically with the issue of climate change in the convention, and in the Ipcc. But the focus is completely different. And when this invitation came with these two aspects of impact and trajectories of emissions, the 195, the government said, well, yes, we want to accept the invitation from the Climate Change Convention, but we want to include that these reports should be developed in the context of strengthening the global effort to address the threat of climate change, and then sustainable development, and efforts to eradicate poverty. So if you look, it seems very simple, but you are bringing elements that are really important, in particular, bringing the social aspects of sustainable development, poverty, which meant that we were dealing also inequalities, as we are going to most likely be hearing from Deborah, from Browning here, but it brings issues that are really interesting because you're going beyond just understanding climate change impacts, but you are looking at the effect or impact on people, on livelihoods. So I'm saying that because I want to stress the fact that you are bringing all types of scientists together and under all the disciplines, I would say. So we have a range of people working, in the Ipcc on this diverse number of topics. I think that I would like also Adelino to say something. I think that it's really important that we are here at the University of Algarve. It's really not only a pleasure to be here physically, but it's really the environment that we need to have to stimulate every single student of the importance of their research, the importance that they produce papers, because we don't do research. What we do is really this whole assessment of the literature that is available to feed us, into each of the topics that we need to address as per this, indication of the governments, right? So it is really important that we have the engagement of the students here, that will be future scientists, that will do their lives, the choice of going into the research, and we hope many of you will do, and have an interest, specifically on issues that we address. Finally, I would say, Adelino, that, we have been hearing this. We have been hearing that the importance of science to feed the policy-making process. So we are talking now of this bridge between scientists and the policymakers. We don't do the products of the Ipcc only to politicians or only for the policymakers. It's a much broader range of people that are interested in the work of the Ipcc, including students. And now more recently, the youth as well, right? So we are now trying to convey very simply, communicate in a very simpler language, the findings that the Ipcc have done through the assessment that takes normally, this 6-year cycle that you mentioned. So we are really thinking that the policymakers should have the benefit of the science feeding into the process, and seeing that the integrated decisions in terms of mitigation of climate change, but not only mitigation. We want to also talk and integrate mitigation with adaptation, having a more holistic vision of the portfolio of actions that could be taken, instead of just taking isolated, but how the whole picture, interlinks, how all these things. And here I see a lot of interest in ocean, but you have ocean, the land, the atmosphere, everything is talking, so we have to have a much more holistic understanding of these things and devise, policies that sometimes are locally developed, regionally developed, or globally, and I think that this is the message that I would like to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Bronwyn, it's your turn. What's the role of social sciences in this context of multidisciplinarity?
Buona noche. I hope you can understand my New Zealand accent. I'm sorry. I am probably one of the newest authors in the IPCC. I'm a political scientist. I was a lead author for 1.5, worked on a scoping report before that, and I'm a coordinating lead author which organizes a chapter on cities and infrastructure. And you can imagine, people said, why is there a political scientist on the IPCC? But there have always been social scientists, especially geographers and economists. And now we're joined by psychologists, sociologists, historians, because as Thelma was saying, there are two aspects. The 1.5 report really stressed that we need far-reaching, transformative change in all aspects of society and economy. So that's not just how we change our individual behaviours, but how we make our collective decisions, the things about thinking about our economy and our choices. And one of the shifts in the IPCC has been to focus on solutions, as well as stating the problems. While we can't prescribe, what should be done, it's important that we set out from the literature what are the range of choices. So as a political scientist, it's really satisfying because I think at the moment it can feel very overwhelming. These problems are really difficult. And we're not going to save the planet one citation at a time, but it feels really a privilege to contribute to a big collective action. And I just wanted to add one point to Thelma and also Yuba's comment about, especially if you're a PhD student or you're beginning and you're interested in the process, I didn't realize that the review process is open to everyone. And right now, if you're following the IPCC on Twitter or you're looking at it on its website, you'll see that the mitigation chapter, which is Working Group 3, is open for registering your interest in making review comments. And you register, you just go online, you register your name and your interests, your skills and expertise, and then you have access under confidentiality to the draft report and you can comment. And your comments, your name, your comment is public. The IPCC has to respond to that, and we are very grateful for it because thousands of people, thousands of experts comment, and if it isn't for that collective activity and critique, that adds this extra layer. So I would really just build on Yuba's point about it's a great way to kind of start in the process.
Thank you. So Deborah, how about this question of sustainability, inequalities and governance in the IPCC scene? Very complicated and large thing. You just have to say a small statement so that we can start thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bronwyn indicated that she is a political scientist, and they are still quite rare in the world of the IPCC. I'm an even rarer breed. I'm a practitioner. So in my day job, I'm a local government practitioner in an African city in South Africa. And why would we have someone like that in the work of a scientific assessment that's being described by my colleagues? It's because, as Bronwyn indicated, we're interested in the science being a tool to allow society to understand the world that we live in, but also understand, importantly, the kind of challenges we face in acting. And we are hoping that that understanding will, importantly, not only improve our knowledge of the world that we live in, but encourage people to act. And why do we need to act? Well, the world is a deeply unsustainable world. And that's what the 1.5 report pointed us to. It indicated that because of past actions, the world is already heated by 1 degree. That 1 degree warming is already dangerous. The report points out that it has very significant impacts, particularly for vulnerable parts of the world, so the Arctic, the drylands, continents such as the one I come from, Africa. So sustainability is a critical element in thinking about how we're going to act, who we're going to act with and for and why, so a critical element. It also points out that if we act, that action may in fact have repercussions in society. So if we act ambitiously to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there will be both winners, so we will win from the ambitious mitigation, which will limit global warming, but there will be losers as well. So for example, ambitious mitigation might in some parts of the world involve using something we refer to as BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and that might utilize large areas of land which are important for food security. So we need to think about the vulnerable people and the social safety nets, if we use those tools, to ensure that those who are already vulnerable are not made more vulnerable. And importantly, having a practitioner also indicates that the scale at which we need to think about sustainability, inequality, needs to be not only at the international level, but we need to bring it down to a level at which people can understand and identify and be motivated to act. And you've heard all of my colleagues speak about the importance of cities, and indeed the panel, those 195 governments, agreed in this assessment cycle to have a very special focus on local through our understanding of urban settlements, but also to commit to a special report in the next assessment cycle. So that's where I'd like to leave it.
Thank you. So after this introduction to set the scene and to give some background, we're actually going to take the questions that were and comments that were made, and I'm going to ask them. Of course, we synthesized some of them so that the panel can start to answer those questions. And of course, the Algarve is, likes very much its coast, and there's a dependency on marine resources. So the first question really is about vulnerability and impacts on marine resources, specifically aquaculture, fisheries, and so on. And I'm looking at Hans because he's going to be the person that's going to give the answer in first place.
Thank you very much, Adelino. First of all, let me emphasize that it is nice to be back in Faro and build on our long-standing relationship and collaboration in the context of marine questions and marine biological questions. And certainly you wonder how an ocean scientist, a marine biologist, or an animal physiologist like myself actually makes it into the IPCC. And it's today it's still a mystery for me how that actually happened. It had to do with our research was focusing from the very beginning on some aspects which are now at the fore of the interest with respect to climate change and its impacts on the ocean and on marine resources. We studied the effects of oxygen deficiency on marine life, looking at animals that live in oxygen deficient environment like marine sediments. And in those places, you also see an accumulation of CO2 that we now know is kind of at the core of human influences on climate change. It's accumulating wherever you have a decline in oxygen, and it has its impacts on organism. And that was actually my entry point, because at the time people were already thinking about what to do, about solutions, and one of the crazy ideas that they had was they would dispose of CO2 in the ocean, into the water, and they would actually think about building CO2 lakes on the ocean floor, which then in the end and got involved actually in Working Group 3. So my origin in the IPCC is Working Group 3. At the time there was a special report on carbon capture and storage and ocean storage was one of the chapters where I became involved. And that started it. And then our research on temperature, comparing organisms from different climate zones, then added the third driver that we are now have identified as being actually currently the key driver in the ocean. The ocean is warming. We are actually now talking about marine heat waves and the effect of temperature on ocean life. And this combination of temperature, oxygen, and CO2, we actually now call the deadly trio. Why? Because in that combination, these drivers have had tremendous effects on ocean life, and that is where our fossil record is also in Earth's history. The deadly trio has been shaping the mass extinction events in Earth's history. In their combination of temperature extremes, oxygen loss from the ocean, and accumulation of CO2 in the ocean, a process that we now call ocean acidification. And marine life is responding to these combinations. We know that from the fossil record and the work on extant organisms, on the living organisms, is also illustrating and deepening our understanding what has been happening in Earth's history during those mass extinction events. And the phenomena observed is that ocean life is specialized on temperature. We are specialized on temperature. Life on this planet has been evolving under temperature conditions, and any deviation from amenable temperature has caused stress to life. We are currently causing climate change at a velocity that is up to 10 times faster than it has occurred during the last 50 to 300 million years, triggering mass extinction events over much longer time periods. So one conclusion we currently have is that current climate change is too fast for ocean life, for terrestrial life to adapt. It's being displaced. It's moving to higher latitudes towards polar areas, staying within the temperature ranges that it has adapted to. And CO2 accumulation, as well as oxygen deficiency, constrain those temperature ranges. That is one of the findings of the hypotheses, the core hypotheses that is currently under investigation, and that is able to explain the additional stress that CO2 and accumulation oxygen efficiency have on ocean life. So what does this mean? That it means your fish stocks are moving. You will have new species along the Portuguese coast. Other fish stocks are disappearing because they are moving further north, staying in the temperature ranges. Overall, we will see in the future, and that are the projections, an impoverishment of marine resources in the low to mid latitudes, some enrichment at the high latitudes, where actually we are already seeing this effect of fisheries benefiting from the warming trend. But this may just be a transient phenomenon. And this is something we've analyzed in the special report on oceans and cryosphere. So this is the general story, and this general trend of life moving, trying to stay within preferred temperature ranges, is also happening on land and has functional backgrounds, physiological backgrounds that still need to be explored, as well as the underlying genetic mechanisms and molecular mechanisms that are shaping the capacity of organisms to adapt. And with this kind of turmoil in the ecosystems, we are going into a period that, in addition to all the other human stressors that we are facing, could be characterized as the onset of the sixth mass extinction in Earth's history during the Anthropocene. It's happening faster than the crisis in Earth's history. We have started it, we have not yet pushed it, to its extreme, and we can still stop it. And that is the good news out of the IPCC assessment reports. Bringing the emissions under control is a precondition for stopping climate change and its impact on ocean biology, terrestrial biology, and on us.
So that's the impacts. But the question is, can we, or is there any possibility of changing or improving them? People talk about blue carbon. What's this blue carbon, and really how can we increase this blue carbon that happens to potentially help in this system?
Yeah, the marine ecosystem certainly can contribute to the solutions. The capacity of those systems, however, is limited. It relies, first of all, on a restoration of ecosystems. So we need a restoration of wood, need a restoration of mangroves. We need to restore seagrass meadows. We need to restore macroalgal forests underwater. Mm-hmm. And their expansion binds carbon. Mm-hmm. In the same way as people are talking in the context of BECCS that Deborah has been alluding to, storing carbon, and you could actually think about ways of collecting that material and then storing it away, and thereby storing the carbon away. But the ecosystem restoration in the ocean has a contribution of only currently per year, maybe 0.5% to anthropogenic emissions. It does not provide an excuse for keeping emissions going. It can help as we bring emissions down in an ambitious way, as suggested by the results of the 1.5 report, with an immediate onset of emissions reduction as soon as possible, and bringing it down by 2030 by 45%, for example, compared to 2010, in order to, on its way to keeping warming within the limits of the Paris Agreement. So, and then when we have brought and are bringing emissions down, the restoration of ecosystems in the ocean and on land can make a large contribution to getting global warming under control. Mm-hmm.
Well, we have some important ecosystems here, like the Ria Formosa, which you have some of these seagrasses and so on, which clearly needs to be maintained. Thelma, is any other of these nature-based solutions that can help to?
Oh, well, yes, it was interesting, Adelino. When the blue carbon has also been mentioned in the Climate Change Convention. I remember the first time it was mentioned there, nobody understood. What is blue carbon? Why are we talking about blue carbon? And then now we understand much more, obviously. There are many more publications, and we understand now that the blue carbon just mean, you know, the marine and the coastal ecosystems and their role in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere. We are now also talking a lot about nature-based solutions, which the blue carbon, you know, these coastal ecosystems and marine ecosystems can help. And the reason why, you know, there is a lot of attention now to the nature-based solutions is the fact that we understand that limiting global warming to low levels like the 1.5 will require you require in our models that have been assessed by pathways that have been assessed by the IPCC to have a net zero CO2 emissions by near 2050. And obviously, you know, it might be impossible to reach net zero and then start the talk of having this compensation of these residual CO2 emissions with carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So just to compensate, you continue to emit, but you know these systems or these blue carbon ecosystems or coastal and marine, as well as land, We are talking about afforestation, reforestation, for instance. So you have a range of possibilities. The issue that we see is that, these restoration, rehabilitation of ecosystems, reforestation, you're talking about ecosystems that are vulnerable to climate change. Mm-hmm. So these things need to be addressed in a much broader framework of ambitiously reducing fossil fuel emissions, which now account for 75% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So if it's not done in parallel, we will continue to have, as IPCC projects, the risks of impacts in terms of floods, droughts, extreme climatic events. So all these might make it very fragile to have these systems, working or functioning in removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. On the very contrary, they could even contribute to release more CO2 in case, for instance, of forest fires, when you're doing reforestation. Mm-hmm. So it has removal when it's working there beautifully, but you can also have its source when you have impacts from, in particular, extreme climatic events.
So one of the questions that were placed was about this question of diets and the food industry in relation to climate change. I'm going to add a little bit more. Here in this region, in fact, in the south of Portugal particularly, where we have drought conditions, there is we built a few years ago a big dam. It's so big, it's the biggest lake in Europe, artificial lake. It's so big that people think there is water forever. But the reaction has been to intensify agriculture with, of course, water-intensive crops like olives and other, all trees, fruit trees, and so on that use lots of water. So there is this issue about the food, what kind of food to produce. There is lack of water in some places, like around the Mediterranean, as has been said yesterday. But I also think there is another aspect that I haven't heard, so I'm just putting it here, is its population size. Essentially, part of the problem is resources, use of resources, and this has to do with population. So food, you require more food. So can you comment on these issues?
Me?
Or have I already commented?
I think that, if I may, it's a combination of different factors and issues, because you indicated diet, you indicated the agricultural system, you indicated the population, and then we can add on the urbanization system. All are part of the problem, and then this is why this is one of the key elements, the key conclusion, finding of the 1.5 is that we need a profound transformation of the whole aspect of the society. Mm-hmm. And then the whole aspect of society, that means, and then to lead at 4 critical transitions that is needed, because you cannot take incremental one. The energy mm-hmm. transition, starting with the decarbonization of electricity, and the infrastructure, and then including the transport, the land-related, that is agriculture, forestry, and all different aspects, and industrial systems. And then all those systems, you need to look at them and then how it might be possible to speed up the transition by providing incentive, by providing regulation and different other aspects, having in mind so the transition are inherently a slow process. And then in some part of the world, it will take some time. In some part of the world, it will be a jump starting. And then if you take the context of Africa, where the new stock of housing is much more important than existing stock. The energy system you need to build could be completely different from what you have seen in the centralized system that exists in industrialized country and emerging economy, and then the design of the urban system and the mobility. And then one have to look at the holistic and then the global aspect rather than isolating the problems, because in isolation it will be very difficult to, but people just pick some element. It's like saying that IPCC said don't eat meat. We never said that. We said that a diet has some implication on the land aspect, because if you want to grow, there is more demand for meat, you need to feed the meat, the animal, the cow, and then you need some land. You need to clear more land. And then there is some combination of different factors so that an holistic approach, holistic view is much more interesting, that give much more element how to act than in isolation. I don't know if Broen or Deborah or Thelma can.
Just check this is actually on. That's a difficult choice, and certainly when the land report came out, as Yuba said, the media picked up on some message that we were encouraging everyone to become vegan. It's not the case. It's an element of choice, but the land report is also very clear that while certainly population and consumption of food products that have a higher carbon footprint is an issue, it also raises the equity issue, because there are large areas of the world where in fact we have large populations that are undernourished, and that one has to look at increasing food security. So across all of these things, what our special reports indicate is that there is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. That when we look at issues of temperature increase, when we look at issues of sustainable land management, when we look at treatment of coastal areas and oceanic areas, all of those are very context specific. And that's why it goes back to the importance of having social scientists as part of our team, is that a response to your question can't be given necessarily at the global level. It really depends on what's happening in a country, it depends on what's happening in a city, and looking at those complexities and thinking about how you bring ambitious action in all parts of society.
So in that case, how does the IPCC address these small-scale scenarios, so at a more smaller level, regional level?
Yeah. So I mean, that's one of the big challenges for Working Group 2, because if you look at the work done that's by Working Group 1 in terms of the projection, your confidence in the projections decreases as you drop down to a more local scale. There are definitely some improvements in the model, and you see what is happening in Working Group 1 now is they've got a stronger focus on regional climate change. They're even in one chapter alluding to cities and the importance of cities, so there's a level of analysis that's more fine scale. Certainly in terms of Working Group 3, who deal with mitigation, there are some regional impacts in there, but the big burden to look at regional and local falls on Working Group 2. And we really structured our assessment report in the cycle to pull out the regional story as an important geography for understanding the changes in important sectors like ocean, water, biodiversity, food, well-being. And so we've got a set of 7 regional chapters which look at the regional areas around the world to try and understand how that context influences those choices that are open to society in all of these sectors, how one might respond, and what the response options are in those areas. But we're also facilitating a next level down analysis, as Yuba has indicated, by having called out urban and infrastructure as a key transition, by having a chapter, and Bronwyn is in fact on that chapter, looking at the role of cities and action at that particular level. Because the 1.5 report is entirely clear. Not only does it call out urban and infrastructure as one of the 4 big transitions, but it's very clear in saying that a world in which we look at pathways which are compatible with 1.5 with little or no overshoot requires action in every single city around the world. It also gives us a perspective on some of the regionalization, and it calls out, particularly in Africa, which is one of the fastest urbanizing continents in the world, that what is done in African cities particularly is absolutely central to achieving that 1.5 development path. So you can see by looking at an assessment that looks at a variety of scales, a variety of sectors located regionally with different elements of different sciences, economics, social, and so on, we begin to get a sense of what kind of actions need to be taken and where that action is important. And I believe we've got some local government authorities in the room, so know that saving the world is essentially in your lap.
So, Bronwyn, can you add more about this question of socioeconomical policies? Mainly, there's a question about trade-offs between sustainable development and poverty. So, can you comment on this?
I think two things. One, it's really good as researchers and writers to be in places like Faro when we come together to work. Mostly we're working on Skype and you're working late, but when you come here, Deborah is always saying, you know, what does this mean for a town? But when the mayor said yesterday, in a case like a water shortage for Faro, there are no good choices. It's expensive, and all of them are expensive and all of them are inefficient, but we have to make a decision. That's the kind of immediate feedback as we're writing to think, okay, so for the people that have to make a decision on Monday, how do we take all this high-level material and make it clearer what options there are and what the strength is of the science behind what might be useful. So it's very important for us to be in places where we're thinking about real problems, because it has an effect on as you're writing and thinking. But on the trade-offs for things like sustainable development and poverty, one of the big differences about these reports lately has been that we've taken the climate issue, and the UNFCCC has asked, and the member states has asked, tell us how to address climate in the context of sustainable development and poverty. So not just climate on its own, but what decision makers know that they've got to do all these other things, address poverty, develop their economy, whatever that looks like. And so we've been able to say some high-level things in the last report at 1.5 about some of the obvious synergies and trade-offs. Like for sustainable development goals, it's obviously good if we can hold the world's temperatures at 1.5. There's lots of literature that says that that's very good for health. It's very good for responsible consumption. Those things work very well. It's really good for cities. It's not so easy to make the choices between how you manage poverty and hunger versus really pulling down our temperatures. This is the harder trade-offs, and or how we and it's going to need careful management. It's going to need careful finance. Local government is obviously the key, but it can't do it on its own. It needs those national and international supports and funding. It doesn't answer the problem, but it is making it local and making it more real, I think, is one of the key things.
If I may, I would rather indicate what we came up with 1.5 is that the climate imperative can go hand in hand with poverty alleviation.
Yes. Yeah.
And this seems very important. It's all related to the choices we make. Mm-hmm. Let us take the case of the African context, and then that related also to the key finding of the report on the energy. Energy is a critical driver for development on energy access. You have the choice in the beginning. You go to decentralized system, or you go to highly centralized system for electrification. If you opt to centralized system based on the traditional way of electrification, that means you leave out a large part of the society. They will never have access to that because the cost will be so high. If you go to decentralized system, and then you will favor and then those type of access at the very local people, very local, the poor people, and so that you combine the poverty issue at the climate issue. And then sustainable development, then you do have that there is some trade-off and there is some synergy, and then the issue is to maximize, is how you make your development more sustainable. And then this is how the SDGs that has been the Sustainable Development Goal that has been agreed in 2015 became interesting, and then to bring those three different equations that has been analyzed in the last chapter of 1.5.
So one of the questions that we had was precisely whether IPCC aligns its evaluation report with the UN Sustainable Goals, Sustainable Development Goals.
IPCC is not aligning, it's assessing the literature. There is a number of literature who address that issue, and we assess that literature. And then our finding is that there is a wide range of synergy. There's more synergy on climate imperative, if you want the 1.5 degree and sustainable development, than trade-off. There is a number of trade-offs. We will not avoid them, and then that is clear to bring those to the attention, and all will depend on the choices we will be making at different levels.
We had a question here. I don't know if you already touched it, but I don't know if you want to add something else. The question is, how can we provide clean energy and adequate water used to achieve socioeconomic and environmental sustainability? You started touching this just before. I don't know if you want to add anything else.
You know, the energy and water, many people have the tendency of, my personal belief is that if you have access to energy, you have water, because that's related, because you can desalinate, you can transport, and then you can also pump water, because the two are related in most of the cases. One of the fundamental elements is related to energy, how you bring the energy access issue. And then the assessment we have made indicated also that where we do have a lot of hope of providing energy access to those who do not have, by the improvement, the technological improvement of the renewable, in particular the solar. And also one of the major problems that was the intermittency, and then that the solar system became much more efficient. It became also much more cheaper. And some of the evaluation from the Bloomberg indicated that in 2010, I think that the storage of 1 kilowatt hour, the storage system costs roughly $1,100 US, and actually is around 160 or 50. And you know, as we have seen also a move toward electrification of the transport system, and then one expect in the coming 5 to 10 years, it may become less than $50 US, the solar 1 kilowatt hour. And so that is a big perspective and a big hope for most of those countries to invest in a much more cleaner energy system than the classical one.
I have another question for Deborah here. Is what to expect of the effect of climate change on human health, public health, what we expect of the effects of climate change on public health.
So again, just looking at the key findings of the special report on 1.5, which indicated there is this very real difference between a world of 2 degrees of global warming and a world of 1.5 degrees of warming. One of the key things that was called out was the impact on health. So what we will find if we are ambitious and pursue that level of warming, that there will be a benefit across the world. And that comes from a variety of things. Obviously, it reduces the spread of vector-borne diseases. Hans spoke about the change in distribution of various species of organism. The vectors that bear disease or carry disease would be part of that. It certainly impacts on the availability of resources, which are key to health. And Yuba has alluded to water as a key element within development. And that lack of access to water, again, would have real implications for public health. Certainly in terms of the need, as Yuba indicated, to think about energy security as a critical part of the development path, without moving to increased energy security for various parts of the world. And again, Yuba and I both come from Africa, so that's often where we refer to. One won't be able to deal with things like heat stress. I come from a city which is probably the HIV/AIDS epicenter of the world. People with AIDS are very vulnerable to heat stress. Without access to reliable energy sources, you can't create cool environments. We're already hot environments. So you'll see a broad-ranging impact across disease, access to water, energy will be a limitation. Obviously, if food security is impacted, and Africa is particularly badly impacted if we look at the 1.5 report in terms of food security with staple crops like wheat, maize, and sorghum, that again will have implications, particularly for populations which are already malnourished. So we see this broad-scale impact on society at 1.5. But again, an important message out of our report is, and this is something that I think we really want to emphasize with people here, we talk very strongly about 1.5 as a desirable goal for us to have as global society. But we have to recognize that 1.5 is not a safe level of global warming. As I indicated when I made my initial input, even at 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, we are seeing significant impacts on vulnerable communities and vulnerable parts of the world. So we will have to deal with those public health impacts even at 1.5. The point is they will be lower at 1.5 than they will be at 2.
Thank you. Well, I've got now a few questions which are a bit of a wild card. That means you choose to answer if you feel like it. So in fact, this area, this region, and Portugal is more and more dependent on tourism in general. For some reason, the big cities like Lisbon and Porto became very popular, but the Algarve, of course, is the top spot. And it's 80% of the economy is tourism. So you can imagine. So one of the question is, climate change and tourism impact on diversification. So one of the discussions we always have is we should diversify the economy, but it's easier just to fall back always on tourism. To diversify, you have to think a lot and make a lot of energy, I guess. And so your comments on this, the possible impacts on tourism and the question of diversification of the economy.
Well, I would just say that this is a very similar problem for New Zealand, but we have an even further transport issue. So one of the key messages from 1.5 is our transport is one of these key transitions. And so thinking about we are based on agriculture and tourism, and so we're very conscious of this transition. And so, I think one of the things is, well, where are the wins? Where are the easy wins and the short term and then the long term? And transport is one of those key issues. So it isn't a help, but it is a key. It is such a problem for us. And we are terribly worried when we read 1.5 just as the public now, not as an author, and start thinking about stranded assets and start thinking about Europe isn't flying anymore. And we go, but we're a nice country, but, it is a lot of carbon to come. So this is a really big problem for our economy, and being able to think about how to decarbonize transport is a key issue, and it's why it's one of these big transition moments. So that's part of the tourism issue.
Maybe I can address this a little bit from the technological side, because this discussion is especially strong currently in Germany, which is so reliant on the German car industry. So decarbonizing transport is very important, and also air traffic, shipping is under discussion, and how to actually decarbonize that. And a logical conclusion for that seems to be that we need an excess of renewable energy, which the world is currently finding difficult to provide and to establish. I mean, shipping and air traffic would need, in order to be maintained at current levels, would need synthetic fuels, synthetic diesel for shipping, synthetic kerosene for air traffic. There are some movements in that direction. I mean, there are experimental production sites for synthetic diesel in Norway where they use hydropower to provide the energy for that, but certainly the costs are still excessive. Then there are synthetic production sites along the same lines for synthetic fuel. You can actually install an app on your mobile where you can buy synthetic kerosene for the air travel that you need to be doing, but you pay excess for your trip. It's not like making it 2 times more expensive, but you can, for a couple of €100, depending on the distance you're traveling, you can buy that synthetic kerosene, and that is probably the best possible way to carbon compensate your air travel, as the respective airline is promising to fuel their planes with that energy source. And then there is the production of synthetic gas, which is replacing and can replace natural gas. You can buy, at the moment, buy into compensation models, and it's a niche market, but it's where you buy synthetic gas for your heating of your house. You will still take the natural gas from the gas grid, but the synthetic fuel is then put into the gas grid, diluting the quantity of natural gas in there, and you can buy the same model for your cars. So there are options, but all of these are not yet to scale, and scaling them up will be part of this energy transition in the transport and infrastructure system that is needed. There's hope, the technologies are there, but the investment flow, the financial flows are not yet enough to really scale this up. And then certainly maybe part of the dimension of reaching that dimension includes mobilizing the CO2 that is in the atmosphere. The cost for extracting that from the atmosphere have come down, and it could be one way of doing CO2 recycling. But these are things, technological options, some of them still at the horizon, and it will need really a major push in that direction.
Okay, I've got one last point for this section of the talk. In fact, Portugal actually is probably, I don't know, maybe one of the countries that has a public domain on the coast for more than 100 years now. Okay, some sections have been privatized in a way for special reasons, but in general the coast is public domain. So one of the questions is, this problem of land ownership and to forcing action on land ownership. So acting on private or public land. So do you have any comments about this? Is there any discussion on this topic? So it's more a legal issue, but it's a practical issue.
Well, I think this discussion, and I take the answer because it's part of the problems addressed in the special.
I don't know if the sound on. No, I think that you switched off by accident. Oh, okay.
It's part of the issues addressed in the special report on oceans and cryosphere. That is the issue of sea level rise, which is a long-term commitment, and which is dependent on the degree of climate. There are tipping points in that system, in the melting of the ice sheets on Greenland and the Antarctic, and it's sending another signal, adding to the messaging from the 1.5 report that ambitious emissions reduction is the best way forward to reach stable and sustainable future. And this future clearly entails, even in a 1.5 degree world, sea level rise could well go to reach orders of magnitude of 0.5 to 1 meter over the decades, if not, and the projections in that report go until 2300, whereas with unabated emissions, the sea level rise which will reach several meters by 2300 and will reach above 1 meter by 2000, may reach above 1 meter by 2100. So this is a big challenge for, first of all, coastal protection and the associated costs, and these are costs of adaptation. If the resources are not there to make that investment, and that is clearly the case in some vulnerable places, it may go beyond their adaptation capacity. Small island development states come into this game, or low-lying coastal areas like in the Arctic, the Aleutian Islands. You can think of those. And I don't know about the special Portuguese conditions, but coastal erosion plays a role here as well.
Yeah.
And the question certainly needs to be addressed. And there is something, maybe a question for Bronwyn. We really didn't go in that direction so much, is how is property loss being compensated for? Is there a right for compensating for property loss? Because if the coastal protection isn't there, over time there may be the need to give land back to the ocean in order to protect the human population. So you lose property. And at the dimension of this challenge, depending on actually ambitious climate action, with the dimension of the challenge ahead, society may not have the resources to actually afford this compensation.
Just a comment on that. If you do look at our special report on ocean and cryosphere, it speaks to tourism, obviously linked to things like skiing and so on, and it speaks to the issues of sea level rise, and points out the complex challenges those offer society, particularly in regions of the world that are heavily dependent, for example, on coastal economies or tourism economies, and calls out very strongly a message which is across all of our special reports, the importance of governance. That when society faces these very complex choices, and you can see you're not getting simple answers from us, because these complex questions don't have simple answers, particularly when we don't have the knowledge of the local context, and there are multiple stakeholders who are impacted. It indicates that we need to think carefully about our governance systems. Who sits at the table to take decisions? Who's losing? Why are they losing? What are our social safety nets? What kind of communities are reliant, for example, on key ecosystems which may be impacted? How do we draw that into our thinking when we tend to have very technologically oriented societies? So the importance of governance, and I suppose that's a big question for those of us who work in government, and I think there are some of those in the audience, is how do we use the tools of state, the operations of society, to have these complex debates, to think about our context, about the kind of changes we need to have. You asked the question, Adelina, around the diversification of the economy in this area. Well, that's only a discussion that the people, for example, in this room can have, because it's this society which knows what its tolerance for risk are, what its resources are, who the key stakeholders are that will be impacted. And so I think that's an important message too, is not only thinking about technological responses to these problems, but societal responses and opening new conversations and new forms of engaging, pulling people who often don't have a voice into society into those debates so that we create the kind of safety nets that will be necessary as we move into what is going to be an increasingly dangerous world unless we ambitiously respond to the kind of challenges that these three special reports have highlighted.
Thank you. Well, we have 3 parts, and the last part is getting shorter. We have about 10 minutes. And the third part is more addressed to scientists. And Hans, you have the chair here to start in motion. What information is needed for the IPC panel to better access, basically? What's your...
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. First of all, we certainly need to say, and that's the basis of, and the result of 30 years of efforts in the IPCC to compile scientific and assess scientific information in the context of climate change. We know enough to act. So the urgency to act is very clear, and the demand for scientific research shouldn't be used as an excuse to delay decisions, which is often has been the case in the past, and for some countries and some delegations, and we are exposed to them in our negotiations, this is still the strategy. So that is very clear. But this said, there are gaps to be filled. On the side of impacts, if I talk as an ocean biologist, very clearly we need more information on the genetic basis of adaptation to climate drivers. What is setting the limits? Is there a chance over time for adaptation to catch up?
Mm-hmm.
As I said, the current climate change is too fast for organisms to respond and stay where they are. This is what certainly people would like to want, to have the resources where they currently are, because they have adapted to that accessibility. But then very clearly, in terms of the research, the implementation side of when we talk about solutions and solution options needs a lot of effort, and it concerns all systems. In the oceans, we can expand on our research what the oceans can contribute in climate mitigation, in adaptation, in a sustainable future of using the ocean resources, knowing more about their biology and how it can be managed to have sustainable fish stocks, for example. How can the functioning of the ocean in climate regulation be maintained? Think about the maintenance of the Gulf Stream, which is passing by here along the coastline, and it's such an enormous system for climate regulation overall in Europe. And so this implementation research, ranging from the natural systems where people think about using the ocean systems in terms of enhancing their capacity to store CO2 and mobilizing ocean productivity, also for the benefit of aquaculture productivity, still maintaining a healthy ocean environment. These are implementation aspects where we currently see a lot of warning signs in terms of how we should manipulate the system. Some people would already put that into the context of geoengineering. What kind of solutions do we have available on the marine side? On the terrestrial side, you have yourself said the water supply systems. Water supply through desalinization of the ocean may be a future to be explored. How to have energy systems in place. Currently, there are experimental studies of using wave energy and combining the exploitation of wave energy with desalinization projects. This is experimental scale, but may well be the future for those places where drought become a regular phenomenon under climate change. And climate change hasn't yet stopped, and we are not yet sure whether it will stop at 1.5 degrees. It really depends on human action. Mm-hmm. Societal transformation, human psychological research. How do we handle these kind of issues? How do we address the inertia that we have in society with respect to pushing the transitions.
Mm-hmm.
We need to adapt, we all know that. But when do we start to adapt? When the first catastrophes have occurred? It's a very human problem currently to move into action in light of something that for some of us still appears to be decades down the road. So there's a huge need for this kind of research, but as I said, the key message must be we know enough to act and build on that basis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. You want to add any more observations on this?
Lino, let me just very quickly, identify some. Yeah, obviously there are gaps. If we think, and Hans have mentioned, some technologies that are being thought of to help this issue of even treating potentially the way we could avoid the climate change, not only by removing the CO2, but impeding the radiation to reach the surface. So you have this solar radiation modification, technology that is still in progress. So we don't know the potential impacts of that in terms of precipitation regime. So there are lots of scientific questions that are still open. Even something simple, like everybody understands reforestation and afforestation, but the IPCC was very clear in the 1.5 that we do not understand clearly the impacts of large-scale deployment of these technologies, and I think that Deborah has also mentioned one of them, which is bioenergy with or without capture and the storage of CO2. You also have a deficit of data. Sometimes you cannot understand, like, deep sea, and then maybe, Hans may say that we don't understand because we don't have data. So people cannot publish because, they don't have observations, how to observe. Obviously, this improves with time, but there are also limits in terms of data available and also the scale of the data that is available. Sometimes you have data that allows you to do a more global assessment, but that doesn't allow you to really, come to more refined, let's say, scales. Mm-hmm. So I think these are just, some thoughts to say that there are limits. And at every assessment, why do we do better? Mm-hmm. Because more data becomes available, the models become every time more refined. So it's, it's like, science is like this. It evolves.
Bronwyn, I think social sciences, maybe some...
I was going to say, it is amazing because there's never been more science, we were talking about this last night, more science available right now at a period of time. But there are still huge gaps. I mean, the big gaps are the people that can pay get the research done. So the global south and indigenous and local knowledge is still really a serious area of bringing those voices and those perspectives and that experience into the discussion. The informal cities, the speed at which people are urbanizing and the scale of those new problems are difficult. And we don't know enough about local impacts of decision making. And I know there's quite a lot of oceanographers in the room. I mean, I remember as a political scientist, the first time I realized that the ocean, this is going to be really embarrassing to confess to ocean people, the first time I realized that the ocean won't rise evenly. And a lot of the community doesn't understand for their proximity to the polar areas or their experiences of sea level rise will be different. So that local impact of the global is not well understood. And I think also how, from a political science point of view, how we sustain democracies through disasters. Because we can't keep suspending our decision making every time and do something special every time we have a disaster. And I don't think emergency is going to drive that. I mean, look at Australia. In New Zealand, at Christmas, we couldn't see, it was grey, thousands of miles away, and we could smell the smoke. So what must it have been like on the beaches? And still the government is, this is my personal opinion, I have to say, not part of the IPCC, but still this is a really difficult decision. So how we actually are going to sustain our decision-making processes, our inclusive democracies in periods of great change, I think is a huge challenge, and we don't know enough about it.
Thank you. So with this, we finish for today and for now. I want to thank the panel and also the audience for coming here. I hope it has been interesting. We tried to answer most of the comments and questions that were put on the registered, and thank you very much again.
Thank you for rescuing me.
Tá. Não, mas não é isso. Ou se põe a gente vai perguntar, não responde tanto.
Boa noite, como vai? Deixa eu descer daqui. Isto. Obrigada. Já botei. Pois não. Então, meu telemóvel. Ah, não, tá normal.